the Overman Warrior Podcast.
Ohio units, UFO crossing state line, heading east into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania units engaging, we're right behind you.
Hi, it's Rich Hoffman here. Thinking in answer to all the Bigfoot reportings that occurred in March of 2026 in Ohio, there's Bigfoot sightings all the time, everywhere. There's cryptids that are always showing up, creatures that behave differently than what you have on the animal record, and that we don't quite have a clear understanding of what they are. A lot of people speculate about dimensional beings, paranormal occurrences, or whether they're actual physical creatures. I think in relation to these Bigfoot sightings, to get a grasp of them, a lot of people are talking about as they're amazed that they showed up, especially in the case of a mom and her daughter who actually almost hit a Bigfoot in the road. It was standing on the side of the road, and it was so close they could have touched it, and it shocked them. And these are sightings that occurred in this one was 8 o'clock at night. So it was dark out, but they have sightings in the daytime in hard light conditions and odors and all kinds of verifiable evidence. And these aren't exactly people motivated to come up with a conspiracy. It's multiple sightings, multiple people by different means of arriving at a conclusion. So it'd be hard to coordinate all their stories into a media conspiracy. So I tend to put a little more credence into these kinds of things. And because of them, the dialogue has gone in one particular direction and has to verify them as some sort of Bigfoot, as some sort of hard creature, some sort of lost Neanderthal that sort of bounce around the peripheral of polite society. And I tend to think of them, even though these Bigfoot left behind prints and evidence of their existence as reported, I tend to think of them as paranormal, as dimensional creatures that come and go, and they may look totally different than when they interact with our four-dimensional space. And I think of that as a quantum entanglement experience more than anything else. And so I think wherever there's a science we see in the Ohio Valley that is consistent with rituals that we saw in Europe and certainly witnessed in the Near East. And I think if you cross it across the Himalayas all the way over into Asia, and if we had proper studies archaeologically of Asian cultures and on up into Russia, you would see pretty much the same thing. Anywhere where there's burrow cultures and curses, geometric earthworks. We're finding out all over South America. LIDAR is discovering under the forest canopy that there's a lot of earthworks that have geometric designs. So we're looking at a glimpse into a religion that isn't well documented. What we know of the period largely survived through the Bible and ancient texts, and you get hints in biblical context of kind of what they're referring to as ancient even then. And so there's a lot of talk and speculation of ancient cultures, and there really isn't any more exciting place in the world than the Ohio Valley. And that means northeastern North America. I mean, all of North America has a ton of stuff. I've talked recently about the Wendover people, and I'll talk about that here as well, and why I think that's such a significant site. But when you start studying Bigfoot, you start looking at paranormal occurrences, just as you would say, hey, there's a paranormal occurrence at Bobby Mackey's. the popular country bar in Wilder, Kentucky, where there was deaths and terrible things that went on, and paranormal occurrences, ghosts or whatever, attach themselves to the circumstance, whether that's a physical connection or a manipulator of some sort of interdimensional trickster. We call those kinds of entities demons in the West. In Islamic cultures, they call them jinn, and Eastern cultures, such as Japan, they call them kami. So all cultures throughout all time have referred to paranormal experiences in some way that rationalizes it to their conscious culture. So for explaining these Bigfoot, I like to turn to a guy I think a lot of, and that's Fritz Zimmerman. He wrote a nice book a few years ago, Ancient America, The Dark Side. And really, essentially, this is a guidebook that chronicles paranormal occurrences around mounds that are well known. And he talks a lot about Serpent Mound. He talks a lot about the Newark Mounds just outside Columbus, just to the east. Mounds all over, Portsmouth, well known. And I've said it, independent of Fritz, everybody who logically looks at these things kind of comes to the same conclusion. If you've ever been to Stonehenge, not just heard about it on TV, but talked about it. One of my favorite books I've ever had was this one by Francis Pryor. I love these guys, archaeologists of England. They do a great job in England. And I actually picked this book up at Stonehenge. It's in the gift shop. There's my little seal that says so. I'm very proud of it. I love this book, and I love their enthusiasm for science in England. And they just discovered, really not that long ago, 500 AD, 1600, 1500 AD, that Rome occupied their island, but only after World War II, and they had bombings that went several feet down into the ground, because you have layers of earth always, especially in densely populated areas, just like you find in Jerusalem. You find many feet of residue until you get down to the layers of particular history. And they just found out, and fairly recently, since World War II, just how deep and how complicated the Roman Empire was that far north, and how many temples and large cities they had put on an influence there. But what's amazing about this book is Francis Pryor does a great job of getting into what was life like before Rome came along. And we find out that there's a very sophisticated group of people, and they had, for a Neolithic society, they were very sophisticated, had well-known, very advanced understandings of mathematics and techniques that you can easily trace back to what the Greeks told in the stories of Atlantis. Sea island, and kind of an island city with lots of canals. We saw the same thing in Aztecs. They build these cities with lots of canals. It's not just Venice these days, which is a modern example. But we're talking about like Flag Fin in England, and this is kind of his baby. Francis Pryor was a primary excavator there, and for the last 20 years they've been going through it. And it's essentially a city, a town built on a bog that they could utilize for long-term preservation, religious reverence, and everyday sustenance. A good place to grow food, make food, live life, and it's quite amazing. It's quite amazing undertaking what they've done archaeologically over the last 20 years there. But what it does, when I hear about Flag Fin from this great book, again, the way they approach archaeology, the English heritage guys, they do still a good job. And it's a shame the rest of the world doesn't do as good of a job as they do in England. But nevertheless, they're doing a lot of great research. And I bring this up because I'm with Fritz on settlement of North America by what they call, well, he has a lot of books. Here's a book by Fritz, the Encyclopedia of Ancient Giants in North America. Good stuff. These are independently published books, but it doesn't make them any less relevant. This is a great collection of findings that have large bones in them, and a lot of scientists will say they're hoaxes. They were reportings from newspapers looking for headlines, and they were scandalously placed. There's over 500 reports here of giant bones. And as I've reported down at the Wendover site down in Florida, they had large bones there. There's a lot of reports of large bones. Too much to be just all hokey, Barnum and Bailey circus type exaggerations from the period, or the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, where you're trying to, put a little flair on a story to get people interested in the truth of it. To say that a 5'5" person is actually 7 foot or 8 foot to attract attention, there's probably some of that going on, but not to the extent that we have reports from Fritz Zimmerman. And there's very few people in the world who have put as much time into exploring the mounds of North America as he has. And a lot of other people have come into it and started to figure it out, which has been great. He has other ones here called the Nephilim Chronicles, Travel Guide to Ancient Ruins of the Ohio Valley. And the Nephilim, of course, are the fallen angels from the land of Canaan, Mount Hermon region. Remember the 200 conspiring angels that worked against God to mate with human females. And the assumption, the premise that Fritz puts forth, which is as good as anything I've heard ever. I think there's a lot of science that could be put into it. But we're talking about conspiracies and why that science doesn't come forward. Here's another wonderful book, the Nephilim Chronicles, the story of how all these what they call Amorites. And I think it's more complicated even what Fritz puts in here, but to get this much work, to go all over the country and figure all this stuff out, is just as an interesting perspective as anything science has ever put out. And Fritz is just too far outside the mainstream acceptability, which is the point of this talk, to really get traction. But he's wrote some great books. I found out he did this one, Ancient America, and I hadn't read it yet. And after all the Bigfoot sightings, I thought, I'm going to go read another book by Fritz. And I read this one, and it turned out to be quite good. Great collection of paranormal occurrences that occur around the mounds. And one thing that archaeologists do well is they can see what they dig up and try to figure out what it meant. And they apply it to like basic human needs, such as, this is what they used to eat. This is what they used to commune. This is what they used to trade. But like in Flag Fin, Francis Pryor's very well-researched concepts there, they would break tools and throw them into the bog, sacrifice to the dead. And this idea of preservation of the dead by using bogs is quite fascinating, and that they would actually throw items into the bog in a depleted or broken state to kind of correspond with the broken person that died and now is in the underrealm or the underworld, or try and figure out what these religions were. Even when you study the religion, think about the religion of the Wendover people, you can study what they made, the clothes they made, the baskets they weaved, the orientation of the burials themselves, but you don't really get to know why they buried the heads with the faces pointed west in the burial orientation. And that's when you start getting into some religious reverence and what does it mean. And even with King Solomon's temple being aligned very specifically to the cardinal points on the compass, east and west orientations. Why did everybody care so much at this period of time for these orientations to the compass, to where the world was? And I know there's a lot of flat earthers out there who want to think that the earth is flat, but the the perplexing thing that you find in the mathematics of a lot of the earthworks that are in North America, especially Newark, is that they have almost the exact same kind of math in them that you find at Stonehenge and Avebury, which I'll point out here in a minute. And so the conspiracy is you don't want to go against the indigenous people argument that Columbus came here, interrupted a cycle of life that was living in harmony, and that's what modern politics wants to kind of usher in. And you don't want to take anything away from anybody's heritage, but what is heritage if you're not measuring the timelines correctly? And so why I bring up this the flag fin incident is because it shows a much higher level of sophistication than the Romans who came and rewrote history to feature themselves as like the dominant culture. That's there's a mound, and I've argued about it for years. There's several mounds. In fact, at Canterbury, at the eastern end of the town, there's a couple that are in the roundabout area near the Burger King, and then there's a really large one you can walk to the top of. And I've always argued that they were there long before the Romans ever arrived. I mean, in the 50 BC period, or up to 150 AD, the timeline, the Romans were probably there. These mounds are likely much older, and these are almost the same construct and precise measurements as you find even in Miamisburg in Ohio. And then the sites in Avebury, there's one there that's almost just like the one. There's a smaller version in Canterbury. There's just a slightly smaller version in Miamisburg, Ohio, as what you find in Avebury. And you see them all over the Ohio Valley, and incorporating with the Stonehenge, and then Serpent Mound, and all these alignments to all these constellations. And what we talk about with the reverence of that is these are a people very concerned with the measurement of not just distances, but in Earth's circumference, which is built into, that's what we talk about the flat earthers. We had a people who were in these regions, who were part of Flag Fin, who were trading in cultures that were seafaring, and they had an understanding of the circumference of the earth, because it's written into the mounds, in the curses that they had and the reverence they had, and that we are measuring occurrences of life over distances of time that we don't consider in contemporary society. But you had for thousands of years, the Wendover people 8,000 years ago in Florida, and then at Flag Fin, it's 1300 BC, just 300 some years, 400 years before the Temple of Solomon was built in Jerusalem. So you're seeing a lot of activity of human thought towards a religious idea that was reflected in mathematics captured in earthworks. And that earthwork culture migrated from you have the Wheel of Giants just outside the Sea of Galilee to the east there. Definitely reverence to constellation observation. That same culture, which this is why Fritz Zimmerman talks about this migration of the Amorites, which is just one giant species mentioned in the Bible. But I think you had tall people, medium-sized people, little people, dwarves, all kinds of factions and species, probably not even documented yet, of human beings or human-like beings that were migrating all over the earth at a time when we just assumed we had to wait for Christopher Columbus to discover North America. And we know that that's likely not true at all. The Vikings were in North America, and they knew to come to North America because there were legends and stories written down that let them know that there was something beyond the horizon, and that people had been doing so for many, many thousands of years, maybe even longer than that. And that always you have these cultures rising and falling constantly. But the best evidence for the migration on what Fritz Zimmerman's saying about his Amorite idea, which I adhere to, and I think there's more to not just Amorites, but many people that were here before the Amorites arrived. You had Native American cultures chronicled in DNA. We call them Native Americans. I prefer not to use that term because I can't say that they're native, because there were people here before they were. There were likely people here before those other people were here. And it's a constant open door of people migrating all over the earth and setting up their cultures. They rise and they fall, they decline, drift away. You have this constant cycle always moving. And the way we've established our science, I'd say incorrectly, is that we assumed there was some sort of linear transition over time. That just wasn't the case. And that's why when we approach issues like Bigfoot through paranormal occurrences, we're not quite getting the picture because we're looking at it the wrong way. And you have to measure these things in time occurrences and not necessarily in your dimensional reality, because you had an understanding of time, that time is a dimension. And if you're trying to work outside time or work within time over a duration of maybe something that's considered over thousands of years, and the rate of occurrence might be much slower than your observable time frame. The timeline of a tree is much different than the timeline of a person. The timeline of a dog is much different than a timeline of a human being or master. An ant just recently born, probably going to live a couple days and then die, is much different than a human being. We all have, based on our living form, a relationship to time. And these people, no matter what you thought about them, had a relationship with time that they observed through mound building. And you don't see that in any other culture that was considered to be indigenous in the North America. This is an imported or an exported element of North American society from other places, likely the way Fritz explains it and the way he talks about in Nephilim Chronicles, coming out of the land of Canaan. And our best hint into that is the biblical context that has survived over time. So here's why it's important to kind of understand what we're talking about when I have some pretty good maps that I picked up. This is by the English Heritage Guys. This is a really good map of Stonehenge and Avebury. And I want to show how not just everybody thinks of Stonehenge as being the monument of reverence that everybody talks about. But when I went there and bought this great book by Francis Pryor, which I devoured and just absolutely adored over the years, it's real good archaeology. It's not a bunch of giants talked about here. That's one thing. When Fritz Zimmerman says the Amorites came from the land of Canaan, they were large people as chronicled in the Bible, and they settled in England, and they worked with things like Stonehenge, and built some of the relics there, worked with the Druids or other species, Celtic people, to create these earthworks. Likely there were lots of interactions with lots of different people, and these Amorite people likely stopped by and worked in regions for a few hundred years or longer, and then kept migrating across the ocean. The Phoenicians apparently built really good boats. If you think about the ark that Noah built, it was a very large boat, and to write about something like that in an ancient text, again, the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're talking about surviving floods. So there was concepts of understanding of the circumference of the earth and how to build big ships to navigate on it. And likely, you had the worldwide trade network at a very ancient time that was not considered, because we have analyzed things based on Roman society that conquered the known world at a time and reset the clock on what assumptions were made, and that everybody came before them was primitive and inferior to them, when it likely wasn't true. They had a different religious outlook and different science, and applied it in unique ways that the next culture didn't respect or adhere to, and they worked like all cultures do to erase that previous history. And that's why we're saying all this about the Bigfoot in North America and in Ohio specifically. When you say, well, that doesn't fit my perspective, that doesn't fit with my worldview of understanding, so it must be weird and we have to reject it. And to understand it, I think you have to go with the proposals that Fritz Zimmerman puts forth. that's based in actual going to visit all these sites and observing that the high rate of paranormal occurrences that happen at mounds, or even if the mounds have been eradicated and built on top of, the paranormal occurrences still exist because the events that created the mounds in the first place, something interacting with that paranormal life form, the paranormal life form doesn't know that it's not there anymore in time and space. So these things show up and they wander around on roads and forests and all that stuff looking for the hook into what was there, and they don't find it. So they walk around lost. They come and go, and they emerge. They disappear. They often look cryptic. Like in this case, the mother and the daughter reported that the Bigfoot they saw 3 feet away had very little facial feature. So that's a problem. So it means it wasn't quite what they expect, what their physical realities would register as real. So while we talk about why Fritz probably isn't crazy, which a lot of people would like to say that he is, let's look at the map of Stonehenge to understand how similar it is to the Ohio River Valley. And specifically sites at Fort Ancient, of course Serpent Mound, of course Newark Earthworks, definitely Portsmouth, that has very similar curses to the ones you see outside, effigy sites that they have outside of Stonehenge. So let's have a look at this map. All right, so this area here on this map, this is a big map. It covers a lot of distance. So this little area here is what's known as Stonehenge. And all these little red places that you see all over, these are all mounds. These are burrows, burial burrows, whatever. A lot of different things are in them. But they're particularly known, they're burrows that are very similar to what you find all over the Ohio River Valley. And especially specific to Ohio. The amount of them is absolutely astonishing. And so when I first went here with my family, and I bought the book, there's the Stonehenge Visitor Center. Really cool place. They've kind of built it like Disneyland these days. Used to be, this is an old road that went through here before anybody really knew what was going on. They used to have a little road that went right along here. I think this was the old road, actually, right here, that now connects to the visitor center. But they redrew the road. Now it goes along. It turns off here and goes around to preserve the site, and it kind of goes around the area. But now the visitor center's here, and you can take a little bus and go up here to visit Stonehenge. And people go and they walk around the circle, take some pictures, and they think it's pretty interesting. They go back, and the gift shop is very Disneyland-like, and I love it because it gives people access to these mysteries. But I don't think anybody really gets the scope. And if you follow this map north, just keep going up, Avebury's several miles up the road. But here you have some very interesting, this is just like at Portsmouth, Ohio, or the way that Newark is connected by road to Chillicothe. Here's a little road that actually goes down to the river. And these are mysterious because they're only meant to be seen from the air. You don't really see them on the ground. There's a very perfect circle around Stonehenge with the path kind of goes through. You can't really appreciate it when you're on the ground, but these are all meant to be seen from the air, just like you have the Nazca lines. Just like we're finding out these kinds of things all over South America, and the same basic geometric shapes to appeal to the best way I would explain it is that has an occult, an attempt to communicate with spiritual beings on a vast scale, because just to the north of Stonehenge itself is the large curse, the Stonehenge curses, which is like basically a giant runway. You can't see it from the ground. You'll have to get up in the air to see it at all. And it's a giant marker. It's over a mile long. And then you have a smaller one here. And you have these features all over the place, actually. And they're meant to be witnessed and experienced. Just they have a paranormal reference point. And when you study these things archaeologically, you just say, well, it's a religious thing. And then you stop there. But these people and the time and the alignments that all this stuff has in relation to the observable universe definitely was purposely ritualistic. Now, if you go over here, there's the Durrington walls. There's an actual wood hinge here. Very similar to what they had outside Cahokia, almost identical to what they built out just off to the side of Monk's Mound, the Cahokian city just outside St. Louis. You're looking at similar cultures that did things for similar reasons, and they have towns and cities all around built within all these earthworks, just like you find in Ohio. And everywhere, again, you see these little circles, those circles, you're seeing burrows, mounds with burials in them. So to apply that only to something that occurred in North America and attach it to an artificial construct of an indigenous species of people is ignoring the true history of migration patterns that obviously this is the same what you find in North America, and we want to then figure out, well, why is that? Why are these things so similar, and why this kind of architecture and this reverence for a period of time where they had an obsession with astronomical alignments that was attached to a paranormal rendering. So that's a lot to consider there. But when I was there, these mounds everywhere, all these mounds. I mean, you look around on the horizon and you see them dotting the landscape. I don't remember seeing all that on too many shows about Stonehenge. And that's kind of one of those things you just kind of have to see it by actually going there. So this is another one of my favorite maps. And to get us an understanding of where Flag Fin is, here's Peterborough here. There's Flag Fin. Down here, we have London here. Okay, you just kind of see where you're at. I've talked a little bit about Canterbury's over here. And then Stonehenge is over in this region over here. Right over here. Right there. So there's a lot of sites, and there's a lot of history kind of hidden and buried here over really since the Roman era came in and kind of made its mark. A lot of this stuff got suppressed and rewritten, as it typically does through history. The previous culture usually gets erased, and then the new dominant culture changes the perspective. And that's certainly, when you look at all these sites, when you really zoom in and you see all these little marks, these are all sites that tell a story that you don't find too much on the news. And I think that the site up here, the Flag Fin, is one of those remarkable sites. Why did they build a kind of a little town on a bog when they had all this other land to build on? Why put something there unless it involved a technology that predates our own assumptions of how to use the land to best benefit? So it's quite a remarkable find. And again, when you start looking at the use of bogs and low-lying areas, such as they did at Wendover down in Florida, which is thousands of years. If this is 1300 BC, and you had the Wendover people 8,000 years ago, many thousands of years before this, then what kind of civilization are we talking about? And when you talk about Atlantis and being and kind of an island city, use canals, you can start to see how legends would be told over time and how they utilized waterways in constructive ways in order to provide settlements and religious reverence. So that's the ancient Britain map I just showed you. So a couple different maps here. This one about Stonehenge and this one about ancient Britain. And it really kind of takes an all-encompassing look at the entire landmass and lays it out to sites that are known and corresponds them to modern sites for reference. So it gives you a great way to kind of see the whole perspective of how history interacts with each other over periods of time, and you can study the ancient past as it correlates with new or modern construction. Now, the first thing I did when I heard about the Bigfoot sightings in Ohio was correspond that to an ancient Ohio map that I have, a haunted Ohio map, paranormal kind of thing, and look at all the paranormal activity that's reported around those Bigfoot sightings, in proximity, close proximity. And quickly, it all comes together that it's an area rich with paranormal activity, and I would attribute that to the occult. We call it occult these days. They wouldn't have called it that in pre-Christian days, before there was a biblical context. You had a group of people, God, to simplify it, God was not happy with the people of the land of Canaan. We can talk about the book of Genesis and how long it took for it to unfold in the way it was told. If you study books of the book of Enoch and the book of Giants, as found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a lot going on with these fallen angels and conspirators against God that were trying their best. You go back to the Tower of Babel. And whether the intentions were good or not, the acts were rejected by God. People were spread all over the earth. It wasn't regional spreading. They were spread all over the earth, as reported biblically after the Tower of Babel. But there are lots of times where human beings were trying to be at one with the gods, the divine council, making deals with the divine council, interacting, trading favors to get there. And God rejected them, cast them aside. The land of Canaan had to be conquered, and we chronicle that with what we know from the written record. But the physical evidence is in the migration of knowledge. And the best way to chronicle that knowledge, I think Fritz Zimmerman is onto something when he says it's the Amorites, one of the species, I call it because it could be different human species, of a human that was much larger, had different cranial patterns, and they migrated. They left the region, they were conquered, and they fled for other places. And possibly they were doing that before Noah's flood. They could have been in North America, likely trading and doing things and bringing evil across the earth in ways that God didn't like. And then when you start getting into this idea of haunts, demons, monsters, like the Mothman monster, what kind of evil is at work in the world, and how did it come about? And when you study some of the occult practices that I think are still very much in practice, and they use some of the same geometric symbols, circles on the ground to bring in demons, or triangles or stars, or ways to communicate a language that these entities are spoken to. Large patterns on the ground of geometric forms in order to attract attention. What were they trying to communicate with? And the best evidence of that is in the chronology of this behavior and how over a long period of time they migrated across the earth. Whether they started in Canaan, moved to the British Isles, and then to North America, or They started in North America, went to the British Isles, ended up in the land of Canaan, or they were in Atlantis. Atlantis was destroyed 10,000 BC by some cataclysm, Younger Dryas cataclysm, and everybody migrated out from that central point, the Azores perhaps, which is one of the latest chronicles. Or maybe it was a set of islands, nations, that went from the Azores into the Bahamas, or all over the Pacific. When you start looking at the time scales outside what we've accepted, and we've allowed ourselves to be defined by Roman occupation, who came, they said, hey, we're here now. We had a merger with this previous culture. We're going to erase them and build our stuff on top of their stuff. You saw that. You see that Baalbek in Libya. The foundation clearly had the temple of Jupiter built on top of it. You see that Romans did that everywhere. You see that with certainly the mounds in Canterbury. They came along. They saw. They conquered. They started burying their own stuff in those mounds to show dominance, just like a dog urinated on a tree to claim dominance. Humans do that over time, and they rewrite history all the time. And the Vico cycles continuously recycling ideas that are tried and failed over long periods of time. And why we study these things is we want to know why those cultures failed, or what were they communicating with. And then if you're measuring time, are the elements they were communicating with still creating occurrences that they worshipped during their day, and they're still emerging in our time? Because the cycles of chronicling stars, a few hundred years or a few thousand years, isn't very long if you're starting to deal with the cycles of the Milky Way. And you're trying to appeal to living characters that live by that standard. And then their manifestation into our existence might show up as a Bigfoot or a Mothman or some cryptid creature that's just doing its own thing, but it's answering the 911 call that someone put in 900 years ago or 10,000 years ago, and they're just now showing up. So when you start seeing a listing of Bigfoot sightings, and they might acknowledge you being there. I think in the case of these recent sightings, 8 of them over a period of 100 hours of time, they often would turn and look at the people observing them, but they didn't really show a desire to interact with them much, including the one standing alongside the road. This road's built in an area where people have probably traveled for many, many thousands of years, and you build a road where it's kind of convenient to build it because it's kind of flat, or it's an old trail, or there's less trees there, less rocks, whatever it is. Over thousands of years, a lot of living entities might have used the same path, and sometimes through quantum entanglement they get entangled quantumly, and they may not be aware of each other, or they might be remotely aware of each other, or even though they might exist on different planes of reality. And that's why I think the Bigfoot that the mom and the daughter observed, they weren't quite in our reality. They might have just been trying to render into our reality, or they were fading back out, and that's why the face wasn't quite there. There's a lot of mights and ifs and all that, but what do we know that's stable? Well, we can chronicle the behavior pattern, the advanced mathematics, the architectural desire to build constructs of a certain kind, and how they migrate across the earth. And you know that the people who built these knew about the earth because they knew pi, they understood circumference, they calculated rotation of the earth, rotation of the Milky Way into these earthworks. And they weren't just one culture, one place over one period of time, but extended over a long period of time over vast distances. And the best hint we have of it, which is why you can't fault Fritz Zimmerman for talking about fallen angels in the Ohio Valley, because if you follow biblical text, which is some of the most reliable stuff we have, reliable because Dead Sea Scrolls chronicle it, say people thought this at a certain time, and here it is, and here's what they thought. And then you can contemplate why they thought it, and you correspond that to actual archaeological sites like you see on these maps. But you have to try to explain why these people in the Ohio Valley built all these very complicated earthworks. And here, this enclosure chronicle has a circuit that numbers out to 666, the name of the beast. It's in the Bible. And of course, you could say, well, anybody who has a reference to the Bible, if you're looking at this from a secular point of view, you're going to see what you want to see. And that might be true to some extent. But you have to see what's obvious. And what's obvious is we don't have a proper measure for what an indigenous person is in North America, because we have to extend our time back, way back, to incorporate the Wendover bog people. We have to understand why bogs were utilized by ancient cultures to preserve, how they even come to that knowledge, and to make towns like a flag fin, built in a very obscure way on top of a bog for mysterious reasons, where they threw broken implements into the water to dedicate them to the afterlife. And where did they get this concept of the afterlife, and what interaction did they have with it, and why they believe such things over thousands of years? Because if some cult comes up and says, well, we believe this, and let's sacrifice some lambs to a god, and maybe it'll rain. Well, why would you do that for thousands of years unless you had some sort of interaction, unless you had some sort of occult relationship? So you have to figure that somebody cracked the code at some point in time, and they use these geometric shapes to do so. And I would say that you have a lot of occultists these days that do the same kind of magic, conjuring up with geometric shapes painted on the ground, sacrifice of blood to try and attract them, and things show up. And when that kind of activity has been done in the past at certain locations, mound sites, and maybe they're not done anymore, but those entities are still looking for who called them. And maybe it doesn't happen right then and there when they were called, but maybe it happens thousands of years in the future. And maybe some of these Bigfoot sightings, maybe, and I say that with a proposal to go find the facts to validate the assumption, maybe we have a culture of living entities that are responding to an ancient understanding of technical use of the ground and geometric shapes by mathematical language that spoke to spiritual entities. We call them spiritual, call them interdimensional, that don't quite exist in our physical reality, but can hear our voice through mathematics. And they could exist on a very big plane, galaxy-wide, or they could exist very small, on a very quantum level. But yet you had an attempt with these earthworks over a vast span of time that came from particular regions, or migrated or interacted with each other over a period of time, which is why you might not find giant bones in the British Isles. You might just have average 5'5", 6 foot figures. And maybe the really big people from the Amorites came, taught some people some things, and moved on. And it ended up in North America, where they were slaughtered by rebellions of other people who came from Beringia or from South America or wherever they came from. Some ancient colony that migrated from the Pacific Ocean that long sank. We don't know until you go dig it up. And as pointed out in these maps, and the point for talking about all this great stuff is the science isn't even close to being concluded. So to write a textbook about it and say these are your indigenous peoples, pass some laws and protect their rights, what we really should be doing is the kind of archaeology that they do in England, which is very adventurous and exciting, and stuff that Francis Pryor does in a great way with a number of people that just really are interesting to watch. I just really enjoy the work they do. And I say the same about the biblical archaeology guys, the Biblical Archaeology Society in the United States. There's a lot of groups that are trying very hard to do good things, but they don't have enough support. There's still a lot more work to do. And in frustration of that bureaucracy getting in the way of that good work being done, people like Fritz Zimmerman go out and they write their own books. They do their own research over many years, put many hundreds of thousands of miles in their cars, for 2 decades studying these things and trying to figure out what they mean. And their conclusions end up in books like this. And I find them infinitely fascinating. But the most perplexing part about Ancient America by Fritz Zimmerman, published just, I think, 2024. And you could go read all these books that he's done, a whole series of them. That this encyclopedia of ancient giants of North America is fascinating collection of all the reports of giant bones that were found. And again, some of them could be hoaxes, could be tongue-in-cheek. People saying that they saw 8-foot monstrous bones, and when they were 5'5" people or 6-foot people. Could be. But I don't think in every case. And the problem with that, with those reports and the reports of the 1800s and early 1900s, is there was an adventure and exploration that I see similar to what they have with Francis Pryor and these guys do in England, which they put, they're exploring. There's Roman ruins, there's indigenous ruins from people that were there many thousand years before they ever were. There's current society. It's all layered. And they go explore it in an adventurous way, and they don't feel like they have to give the bones back to some indigenous tribe to show respect for the fact that another culture came and took their land from them. They're out there trying to explore and find out what's really going on, what's really been happening. They put science to it, and that's what science should be doing. Not falling into some political sentiment that was built on a false premise. And I say that not to remove anybody's rights to anything, but we're talking about scientific validity here, and the ability to understand who we are today based on who we were yesterday, or who was there before us, and what mistakes they make that we could correct. And what you find when you start really peeling back the layers is the fear is this previous culture has erased the culture before it. They set a benchmark, forced everybody to adhere to it, and try to pretend like all the paranormal references are hokey pokey nonsense, when really it points back to a previous culture in their science that we need to understand, because that is still interacting with our life here and now. And we might call it a ghost that's banging on some doors in an attic in some haunted house, or it might be Bigfoot going around, or it might be some strange winged creatures like Mothman flying around before you have some major tragedy, because they are existing outside time and space, and they know something's about to happen, and they want to observe the conditions before it happens. The science of why all those happen and their occult references and how they interact with our current circumstances is important to know. And you can't really say, I saw a Bigfoot and it's a mystery, and then say, the people who report are kooky, let's move on, go to McDonald's. You have to understand, why did all these people for thousands of years, in some cases over 10,000 years, make all these geometric marks all over the earth? And specifically the migration from the land of Canaan, Mount Hermon region, which is what Fritz is saying he thinks happens, the fallen angels as chronicled by the Bible. It's the best story we have right now to talk about something in the ancient past and explain why there's so much evil in the world, and how they might have migrated from the conquest of Joshua into the British Isles and then moved over into North America, perhaps in sequence or perhaps in remote periods. And the Wendover people of Florida give you a hint as to how that might have happened. And perhaps it wasn't linear, but it was like a star-like pattern where they migrated out from a central location, Atlantis. And when we talk about a culture built with canals on the water, why would human beings do that? And how would stories like that move through time? All you have to do is go to the Flag Fin area and see why they built such a large village metropolis on a boggy waterfront when they had choices elsewhere. And to what extent did they believe that such a magnificent undertaking at a very prehistoric time would be needed? And when you look at the Flag Fin and compare it to Stonehenge and moving all these big rocks around for not for the sake of saying we can do it, but for the case at Flag Fin, preservation of the wood. How they even know that the bogs would preserve the wood and keep them from rotting? And then the reason to build things in stone is because you're dealing with measurements in time, not so much just saying, hey, there's the star Sirius up there. Oh, Venus is over there, and there's Jupiter. Oh, we understand the Milky Way patterns and the path of souls. Here's these complicated roads we're going to build so the soul can see where it needs to go to the afterlife. Why'd they think that? We have to understand the science of why. And that's why it's important not to rationalize away the Bigfoot sightings and to say it's crazy, it's nonsense, doesn't fit our political order of the day. My argument is it's a politics you have to understand, because they build a political order, they build infrastructure, they build human society and belief systems around observable conditions. And they had advanced math that allowed them to communicate, obviously, with a quantum realm of competing life forms or corresponding life forms that had a relationship with those people at a time we called primitive. And they were called primitive because the Romans came along and said, we're more sophisticated than those guys. They're walking around in their underwear, and they're making their buildings out of thatched huts. And they are hunting with spears. We're much more sophisticated. And that was an assumption we took because the written record was preserved by the Romans, including a lot of what ended up becoming the Christian worldview was translated by a Roman Empire trying to hold its empire together. And so you get a lot of translations, and they had some books of the Bible that made it, some didn't. And what we do have is amazing to consider, but it points in directions that say there's more to dig up out there. And you need to go look for that evidence. And to Fritz Zimmerman's point, that evidence shows up in the mounds of Ohio and their relationship to the British Isles. And visiting the site myself, and at Stonehenge especially, there's no question, because I live in Ohio and I wondered about them for my entire life, and I've been thinking about them the way Fritz has. And when you start seeing how the broader world is going, you see that these are the same people. And the definitions we've been given through academia was not sufficient enough. And to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, no more evidence. We're going to hold this line because we want to preserve our rewriting of history, so the historical narrative stays in control of us until the next civilization comes along and erases us, only to rewrite that history. Then you never know the truth. And when you see a Bigfoot run around out in the middle of the woods somewhere, and almost gets hit by a car by a mom driving her daughter down the road, and they both report the same thing, you have to take it a little more serious and say that there's probably a little more to it, and that we are only scratching the surface of what needs to be known. And quantum physics, I think, will make a lot more clarity to these mysteries as we untangle them. But for the time being, we have a relationship for many different peoples over a vast span of range that wanted to communicate with these paranormal entities, and that was chronicled in this very fantastic book by Fritz Zimmerman. Love the guy. I think he's awesome. There's a lot of people who, and back in the day when he first wrote some of these books, especially this one, people thought he was pretty kooky. But no one's come along and said that Serpent Mound is anything other than the best observations that people like Fritz Zimmerman have been making about it. It's far more complicated than just an earthwork where they wanted to pay reverence to some burial rituals from indigenous people, falsely classified that way for the convenience of the textbooks that were written in early anthropology and archaeology to justify their existence, to get grants from the government. That was a false premise that was immaturely rendered and put forth as fact as we have a lot more science to uncover. And you just get a tip of that hint in sites like Wendover and Flag Fen by really good archaeologists like Francis Pryor, who really did some great work and had an open mind enough to say, maybe we should rethink some of these things in an academic way, but let's be a little Englishly playful about our assumptions so we can get to the truth. And it's the same thing that Fritz Zimmerman's done, but he's been pretty much alienated from academic society because he's too passionate. And he did a lot of this work for free on his own, and he shares these books and all this knowledge with people for very little notoriety to himself. But yet his passion has done great works to explain awesome mysteries that show themselves occasionally in paranormal occurrences, such as the Bigfoot sightings in Ohio in March of 2026. And I'm sure many more to come. And it offers an insight into the Mothman sightings, which is why paranormal research is a good side gig that I enjoy. I think it's fun to think about these things. It's a good thing to ask questions and then go seek evidence to support or reject the premise. But so far, you ask the questions and you start getting paranormal answers and you start getting these kinds of reports, and it makes people like Fritz Zimmerman come across a lot smarter than anybody's giving him credit for. And a lot of things he said over 20 years have turned out to come much more true, and academia has reluctantly had to come to him rather than him going to them, which is a good lesson. And we have a long way to go, but we're getting there, and getting there in bold and great ways. And it's important to have those discussions so we can get there even faster, which is why I'm talking about it now. Anyway, it's Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe, make tomorrow a better day. If you ever read my book, The Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. I think I'm going to be doing a lot of things that people are going to love a lot, and along these lines, because there's quite an interesting story that's emerging that needs to be told, that concerns, I think, every human being that's ever existed, that currently exists, and that will ever exist in the future. It's important to understand how all this goes together. And I think we're scratching the surface now. Anyway, have a good day. It's exciting out there. See you later.
Thank you for listening.